note, I'd like to request the first speaker we have. We have Priscila Lopes, Professor of Human Ecology at UFR in Brazil. Wait, I need to stop sharing mine. And yes, I'd like to request Professor Priscila to please give your talk. Thank you.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Samia, before I start, can you please remind me, just warn me 5 minutes before my time, please? I'm also setting an alarm here, but just in case.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So today I will be talking about the lack of perspective on integrating social-ecological system in marine spatial planning. I know that you guys probably went over a lot of the definitions yesterday, but I would like to highlight two main aspects here. When we talk about MSP, what are the main goals? I just chose two definitions that I found, two main ones that have been used. And I would like to highlight the difference between these two definitions of MSP. For example, in the first one, when we're talking about implementing ecosystem-based management, we don't even see the word social. The goal is to allocate space for biodiversity conservation and for sustainable economic development. In the second one, we see the definition as it's a public process of allocating spatial and temporal distribution of human activities, and in this case, we have the third pillar that was missing to achieve ecological, economic, and social goals. This is just a very brief introduction, just so we see that from the beginning, not everybody had it clear that we needed to have the three pillars, not only the economic one, but also the ecological and the social one. Sorry. Yes, I have to authorize people that want to annotate. So when we look at the summary of what marine spatial planning is supposed to be, we can see that it's supposed to balance all of these three pillars, ecological, economic, and social goals. It's supposed to be integrated across sectors and agencies. It's supposed to be adaptive and anticipatory and participatory. When I look at these definitions and I look at the concept as a whole, a few questions come to my mind. For example, which social goals exactly? And in the interest of whom are these social goals being promoted? Which agencies are being included? Which agencies are being integrated? Are we integrating the agencies of the weakest links, the weakest stakeholders in the process as well? Is it really anticipatory? Can it anticipate the burden that allocating different spaces will have on the fishing communities, for example? Is it actually participatory? Are the poor ones, are the less powerful ones, are the usually invisible ones being taken into account during this process? So these are few questions that I would like to propose more as points of discussion, especially towards the end, because I think it's especially important in a moment when MSP is gaining relevance throughout the tropics. It's just now coming to different countries and being used and being proposed as a tool to be used in different countries. So why do I think it's especially important in the tropics? Because even though I know that there are communities, fishing communities especially, that's going to be my main focus here, indigenous communities all over the world, we know that in the tropics, these communities tend to have a stronger attachment, a stronger dependence on the ocean. So whatever we do in terms of MSP will have an effect on these communities. So it would be nice to have an idea of how MSP is being done so far. And it's hard to say that we can have an idea for what's happening in the tropics because it's just beginning. But we know what's happening, for example, in North America and in Europe. And one study has evaluated how this process has been done in Europe, for example, with more than 12 main case studies. And one main point that they have identified is that MSPs tend to be driven by specific sectorial goals. What does that mean? For example, MSP will be proposed when there is a very specific interest in place, like wind farming, wave energy production, or even the establishment of marine protected areas. So the goal, the beginning, the start of everything is not necessarily the idea that we need MSPs, but somebody or some company or there's some powerful interest that wants it to happen. And for example, it's very common to, in those cases that have been evaluated in Europe, they came to the conclusion that some decisions were actually pre-made. They knew already what was going to happen. And even when the decisions were not necessarily pre-made, they saw that some very powerful stakeholders were capable of going around the participative platforms to use their influence to change the final outcome of MSP. Another point that was identified was the fact that a lot of the decisions were either ad hoc or top-down. What does that mean? If they want to say, if the goal is to implement wind farming, for example, but they know that through MSP, they also need to allocate space for marine protected areas, they design the whole thing in a way that they'll put the MPAs, the marine protected areas, in places where they will interfere the least with their main goal. So MPAs can be designed to not be an obstacle to larger sectorial goals. In that case, it's not, this is the whole process in how MSP is supposed to be done. I also think that you guys went through this yesterday at some level, but there are different phases. In all of these phases, you can see what's marked here in blue is where there's supposed to be stakeholder participation. And in Europe, there has been, more often than not, they follow all of these steps. But in the end, what happens is in the final step, when the final plan is supposed to be done, everything that has been decided and discussed by the less powerful stakeholder is overridden. So in the end, all of these instances where they were supposed to have participation, they were just talking shops. They were just numbers. People were signatures that can prove that there was some participation, when reality is that their opinion, their values, their real interests were not necessarily considered. And finally, when we look at the priorities behind MSP in Europe so far, you can see that a lot of the priorities are more related to blue growth priorities. What does that mean? A lot of economic priorities, development with economic goals. And in that case, to justify the environmental aspect of MSP, they can use what we call blue washing narratives as an analogy to greenwashing narratives. So they can justify the economic interest behind everything by giving a polish of an environmental concern. So it's not surprising then that in most of these cases, traditional and local communities, especially those that rely on inshore fisheries, or some of them, they can use offshore fisheries too, but in a limited way, they have been squeezed out when the priorities are set. They are overridden by the economic priorities. And one point that we can start by acknowledging is that MSP will affect local communities. And when I say that, I don't have any judgment attached to this fact. I'm not saying that they will affect the communities negatively necessarily. It can be good for them in the long term. But it's important for us to acknowledge that local communities, be them traditional, indigenous, or regular, more recent fishing communities, they will be impacted by the process of MSP. In general, so far, when we look at what's happening to the communities in Brazil or in different parts of the tropics, we can see that the effects on these communities have been negative. And these are the ones that have, so the idea is that everybody has to compromise some. But in reality, when we look at what's happening, we see that the biggest compromises are on the weakest links, those that can have less powerful to negotiate their own interests. And one of the things that sometimes people in charge, whoever, it can be the government agency in charge of proposing MSP, one of the things that they cannot realize is that for local communities, oceans, the seas, they're just not places where you get your money from, where you get your income from. The oceans are relational seascapes. They have attachment, they have different levels of attachment to the landscape that's not just monetary. So when we simplify the view of the seas to money, we lose a lot of this information, and that's a source of important conflict between communities, among communities, and between communities and other levels of government, for example. I always talk about one specific case where I worked in Brazil. It was a MPA where the conflict was put as an economic one. The fishermen were complaining that they lost access to their grounds, and then they were losing money because they couldn't fish as much as before. So when I came up with a solution where I estimate their losses, their economic losses, and I proposed some economic compensation, the truth actually came out, and they said, we don't care about money. It doesn't matter how much money you offer us. We lost the grounds that our grandparents, that our parents used to fish in it. We lost the grounds where we used to take our families on the weekends for a swim. So it turned out that the conflict was not necessarily an economic one. It has much more attached to it. And if we don't understand that there is more than money behind everything, we might be incapable of understanding why conflicts arise when we are proposing either MPAs or a more extended version of MSP. And when we overlook this kind of shortcoming, we risk coming back to what we saw with land and conservation, with land and development, which is the risk of grabbing. This is a concept that came from, we know of land grabbing, for example, when people or companies appropriate parts of land that do not belong to them. This was used with green grabbing, when even conservation NGOs were using parts of the land to promote conservation, but at the risk of excluding locals that were already there. And now we see that there is a real risk of ocean grabbing, with people being excluded from their own areas, having their access denied to the places where they're used to. Sorry, something happened here. But it's important also that we don't think that everything that happens in the ocean is ocean grabbing. I'm not going to walk you through all of these steps, but there are a few questions that we can answer to make sure that ocean grabbing is not actually happening. So first of all, we know, for example, there has been some reallocation of space and how the resource is being used and by whom. So we know there's marine spatial planning happening, for example. But the next question that we should ask is, has this MSP undermined human security or livelihoods? And or has this MSP resulted in worse social ecological well-being? If so, then we are talking about ocean grabbing. If not, there's been a redistribution in how the space is used, but it hasn't compromised social ecological well-being and livelihoods of communities, then it's not ocean grabbing. So it's important to have this clear division in mind. Another point that's important for us to know is that marine spatial planning, when it comes to the agenda, it's already a transformation in how we look at the sea. And by transformation, we mean like a radical shift of how things were done in the past, in relation to how things were done in the past. So it can be positive, and in this case, I would like to look at a transformation in a positive way, but it has been incomplete so far. It's a transformation, but it's a transformation that has overlooked the social ecological outcomes of its implementation. But instead of looking at this, instead of looking at MFC as a huge problem, perhaps we can look at it as an opportunity. Okay, so we think there is no time for advances done in a slow manner, step by step. We think it's important to promote transformation or transformational uses of the sea. But let's make sure that this transformation is also socially ecological fair, just for everybody that's using the oceans and the seas. So my proposal here is that we do more than simply opposing the initiative, but we should use it as an opportunity to catalyze the shifts that we want to see it. And the shifts that we want to see, it shouldn't be just economic ones. We want to see shifts that promote both ecological and social sustainability as well. And perhaps I put this as a question mark here, so it's open for discussion. Perhaps it's also time, if we want to make transformation socially and ecologically fair, we should also be talking about blue degrowth instead of just blue growth. And this concept brings the idea that it's time, for example, for us to downscale production and consumption. But this downscaling should be done in an equity-driven way. This means promoting much more social economies based on cooperatives, for example. The focus should be on human well-being and ecological conditions at the same time. So by human well-being, I mean not just the social, but also the cultural aspects of everything that can form the human well-being. In terms of fishing communities, it's not just, we shouldn't be talking necessarily about downscaling their production, because that depends on what's going on in that specific situation, depending on the situation of their stocks, if their stocks need to be exploited less, or if they're fine or not. But it's important to promote their diversification as well, promote alternative uses, alternative economic uses of their resources, for example. And another important point is when we think about blue growth or blue degrowth, is that communities can have ideas that we didn't think before. For example, one thing that is usually promoted in the Western management, fisheries management, is the use of ITQs. But communities on their own have proposed that instead of using ITQs, which can result in concentration of income and of power, why not giving quotas to the communities, and that these quotas cannot be tradable, for example. So we should look at these alternatives that they are coming up on their own, because in the end, it's a matter of ocean justice. It's not just a matter of sustainability economically and ecologically. It's also a matter of social justice. So if you want to promote just transformation, and transformation that delivers all the ecological and all the social benefits that we would like to see for the ocean-dependent people, then perhaps it's time for us to talk about 3 types of justice within social justice: recognition, procedural, and distribution. Recognition justice is the one that recognizes pre-existing rights. So communities that have been there for hundreds of years, for example, they have their tenure rights. So it's not enough to just overlook them, to ignore them. They can have governance systems in place. And they have different ways of living their lives, and those should be respected. When we talk about procedural justice, we are talking about actual inclusion of locals in decision-making. We're not talking about talking shops anymore. We want them having their voice heard because they have their own knowledge, they have their own perspective, which may be very different than ours, but it's valid and it should be considered. And we are talking about distributional justice, which is perhaps where we have more room for advance a socially just agenda. Because here we can anticipate negative consequences of MSP, for example. But more than that, it's a chance for us to improve equity in the distribution of benefits. So we know that even when we find perfect systems or systems that look perfect in small communities where they've been managing their own resources and it has been worked sustainably, when we use like a lens to see the details, we usually find that women, for example, are left behind. So why not using the MSP and including it in the agenda, the idea of promoting social equity distribution of benefits of how we use the space. So my ideal social-ecologically transformative MSP would be the one that can deliver both.
2 minutes. 2 minutes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm finishing. And ecological sustainability. I'm not going to go over this, but this can be, if you guys want, we can discuss it later. We have proposed the framework for just aquatic governance. This has been proposed for the Amazon, which has an ocean component as well, but you can see here that the base has been the watershed recovery conservation. The whole framework is based on the 3 aspects of social justice. We give specific directions of how we can achieve cultural diversity, how we can use cultural diversity to promote social justice within a framework of how we reuse the space. So I would like to finish with questions for all of you. How can we catalyze these important changes and make sure they are included in MSP? For example, I think it's time for us to take the idea of just transformation from academia to the front. We have to force some legislation embedment and make sure then the MSP will be a truly socio-ecological transformative approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, if you stop sharing.
Let me see.
It's just on the top. Did you stop sharing?
Here.
Yeah. That was absolutely excellent, and what a wonderful, wonderful start to really lay the foundation for lots to discuss on and opening for a few speakers coming up. If anybody has questions, please address them in the chat, and we will address this after the other speakers are done.